2005, looking at all the households, right? On average, the average American household was notably better off along all these measures in 2005 than they were in 1971. With the exception, of course, of the telephone, and why is that? Because they all got cell phones, right? Which is a huge improvement for a whole bunch of reasons in terms of quality and all the things we can do with the cell phone. But the other interesting comparison is these two columns, which is, if you look, for most goods, poor Americans in 2005 were more likely to have those goods in their house than were the average American family in 1971. And there were things like microwaves or VCRs or personal computers or cell phones that didn't even exist. Nobody had those in 1971. Poor Americans today, over half of the households have VCRs or microwaves, almost 100%. And almost half in 2005 had cell phones or personal computers. And by the way, both, I haven't seen the latest data, but I'd be shocked if cell and personal computer were not now into the 50 or 60% range. So when we ask the question, are the poor getting poorer, okay, we can look at that income data and say, well, look, lots of people are moving out of poverty. But we can also say, well, what does it mean to be poor, right? What it means to be poor in the United States is getting better and better through time. And there's an old story about when the Grapes of Wrath, the movie The Grapes of Wrath, which of course is a story about how American capitalism supposedly treated the poor folks so terribly and so on, and drove them west and all that. It was shown in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet leadership showed it as a kind of propaganda film to show their citizens just how bad things were in the United States. When the Soviet citizenry saw this movie, their immediate reaction was one that caused the Soviets to no longer show the film. You know what it was? These poor Americans were going west in a car. And the Soviets said, wait a second, this system stinks, but their poor people have cars? No, so it didn't. I think there were 3 showings, and then all of a sudden it was gone. Because we're not going to show that. So what we mean, again, what we mean by poverty, and I think one of the things we can talk about in the Q&A is, do we want to define poverty in absolute terms or in relative terms? Why would it matter how we define it? How do we think about these things? But what it means to be poor in the United States has changed over time. And the sort of real ability of poor folks to consume has grown. And it seems to me that's one way of indicating that poor Americans are getting richer. And what's nice about this data is this doesn't track households. This is different households from year to year. So even if you accept that static comparison we started with and say, well, we're just going to compare, whoever is poor year to year, even by that methodology, if you look at it in terms of consumption and not income, you get this. Of course, why is this happening? Part of the answer is back to the first myth, right? As the cost of goods has been driven down and down and down, more poor folks can afford things that only rich people could have afforded years and years ago. As the economist Joseph Schumpeter said, I'm paraphrasing, the great accomplishment of capitalism is not that it enables the rich to live well, because the rich have always lived well, but that it enabled the poor to live well for the first time in human history. And when we think back over centuries and centuries of human history where being poor really meant being poor, to look in the Western world and say, well, what it means to be poor is to have all this stuff, that's an accomplishment, right? And to sort of suggest that somehow the poor are getting poorer in the face of this is a tough road to hoe. So that's myth number 2. Myth number 3, which has been in the news recently, interestingly enough. There was a Wall Street Journal piece, and there was a big study, and then there was a Wall Street Journal piece recently that talked about just this point. And the myth, of course, is that women earn 74, 75, pick your number, cents for every dollar men do. As with the other myths, there's a grain of truth here. If you average up all the earnings of women and all the earnings of men in the labor market, it comes out to about 75%. The problem is, as the first bullet indicates, you're comparing averages, not individuals. And oftentimes people take this 74 cents in a dollar figure to mean, oh, women are being discriminated against in labor markets. Or more precisely, right, that what's happening is that women are being paid 3/4 of what men are for the very same work. And that's not what that figure means, right? The fact that 74% figure is an average across all the kinds of different jobs that men and women have. And part of understanding what the myth is that men and women have different labor market characteristics. So we would expect them to earn different amounts. There's no reason to think, for example, that men and women look exactly alike in terms of what they look like as they enter the labor market. So, for example, to use the language of economics here, men and women have different amounts and kinds of human capital. And by human capital, we simply mean the sorts of education and job training and experience, all the things that make you productive, right? That make you productive in the way that a machine would be, hence the phrase human capital. Another difference here is that men and women have differences in their in the degree to which they work part-time versus full-time. Okay? And even the same job, part-time versus full-time, we tend to pay full-time people more, part-time people less. And so the fact that women tend to prefer part-time work more than men, that matters here. Differences in experience and tenure. Of course, one of the fundamental labor market fact when we look at the gender wage gap is labor. And I don't mean working labor, I mean women in labor. Right? Having kids and raising kids is what matters, one of the things that matters the most in terms of the difference in outcomes between men and women. And the fact that women are still the primary caregivers of children mean they're more likely to interrupt their work experience, they're more likely to be at a job less long than men are, and all those sorts of things affect the kind of wages. And then finally, men and women just go into different kinds of work for reasons that we can talk about and I think are interesting. But the fact is that women prefer some kinds of jobs that men don't prefer, and men prefer other kinds of jobs that women don't prefer. Of course, we also socialize men and women, boys and girls, into sort of thinking that certain kinds of work might be men's work and women's work, and that might matter here too. So let's look at some of the data here. This is going to keep really busy. And I think we'll make sure that's everything on this slide. I think so. I just changed these slides around this time because this PowerPoint looked really old, and I put it in a new thing. So I'm not sure. Things might show up out of anywhere for the next couple of minutes. These are bachelor's degrees, again, earned by women and men in 96, 97. This data is a little bit old, but the pattern remains more or less the same today. And you can see the lighter aqua-y looking bars are men, the purple bars are women, and you can see men are more likely to go into engineering, computer science, and business, women more likely to go into psychology, education, the so-called helping professions. Those differences matter, right? It turns out that these jobs at the bottom of the scale, psychology and education, tend to pay less than the jobs at the top of the scale. So if you have more men going into the better paying jobs, more women going into the lower paying jobs, you're going to get differences in wages. Not because employers are discriminating, or not because employers are paying women less for the same job, just that the job characteristics of men and women are different. Okay? Another way we can look at this, another way we can see this issue is through this notion of changing work expectations. This is really fascinating. Depending on your age, you can appreciate this. In 1960, there was a survey of women taken in 1968, and there was a group of white women in the United States, age 14 to 24, and they were asked, "How many of you imagine that you'll be working at the age of 35?" 28% said they thought they would be working. Turned out that 70 of them were actually in the labor force in 90% were in the labor force in 1980. Now, why is this important? Okay. Well, look, in 1968, if you're thinking to yourself, well, odds are I'm not going to be working at age 35, you're going to make certain decisions in college or about going to college, right, that are premised on you not imagining yourself working at age 35. To the contrary, if you imagine yourself working at age 35, you'll make a different set of decisions. And what's important here is along comes 1980, and many of the women who didn't imagine themselves working were working. They're entering the labor force with fewer skills, with less preparation than they would have had if their expectations had been more accurate. Turns out that expectations